So while all this is happening up here, people are fighting back. We've got the Urban League in Nebraska. We've got the Green Book, which I talked about. We have tenants' rights, so we're places like in Chicago and New York where we were forced to we weren't able to own homes, so we had to rent. People got together to fight for their rights because they knew that they were being exploited, because landlords and property owners would chop up apartments to even smaller than when they had white people and then overcharge black people. So black people would use more of their income towards rent. Ooh, the DePores Club. So this, I believe he has a building named after him at Creighton. So he was a priest at Creighton. He was kind of radical. Even though the other priests at Creighton did not like him, and they literally would not sit with him in the lunchroom because that's how grown-ups are. But he started an interracial group of young people to fight back against these things happening in Omaha. And he did it in the late 40s and the early 50s. So it was even before the Montgomery bus boycott. It was kind of the forerunner. It didn't last that long, but it is pretty interesting that it happened here in Omaha. So we're gonna go into the 60s to the 90s. So at this time, we talked about kind of the deindustrialization of the United States. So we're not having factories and stuff. So capital flight, so we're losing money in the cities, but we still have this idea, we definitely need, cities are the way it works. We need people to come downtown to work. We have to maintain a city center of some kind. So that's when we start thinking about urban renewal and freeways and interstates, because the idea is we want to make it as easy as possible for basically white people in the suburbs to be able to get into a city, work, and then go home. So we declare certain areas of a city blighted, we tear down homes, and then we put interstates, highways, freeways through them. So just think about any city that you've ever been in and ever driven in, and where the highway goes through. So in Omaha, how the North Freeway goes straight through North Omaha, and it's not even, it disconnects one community. And here, if you look up here, we have Eddie Chambers. This is when he was super young. And this is what he said in 1985 about the North Freeway. They said the North Freeway would promote economic development, but all it did was displace people from their homes, raise unemployment because of the loss of local businesses, and gave outside interests stronger control over the area. This is interesting because it happened in Omaha. So in 1963, there was an Air Force captain, Michael King, this guy right here, and he worked at Offutt in Bellevue, and he was not allowed to live with his family in base housing. He was only allowed to live in North Omaha. So he had to take a 45-minute commute to work every day, while his co-workers could get to work in 15 minutes. And that usually surprises people because, it's service, it's, our country, the troops, support them. Not if you're black. It's still messed up. They didn't start getting, integrating that until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. And that impacted a lot of different communities across the country. Cities are basically dying, and we're losing money. So that's when it starts. We're losing money, so we can't provide as many services. And we have the planned shrinkage, which I talked about. Benign neglect, so they let areas that were basically black and low income, they just kind of let it fall apart. They just stopped taking care of it. So in 1980, the State of the Black America Urban League of Nebraska says, regarding this phenomenon, the city planning department stated in 1978 that the northeast section is being slowly drained of the families most needed to stabilize any recovery efforts and becoming a concentration of low-income, unemployed, and underemployed families. So they just stopped taking care of parts of the city, and they deteriorated. And that's when we start having a lot of epidemics. So we've got heroin, AIDS, crack, all these different things that are happening. Because there's not the services, there's not jobs. These things are happening in the cities, which causes more white flight. White people are just fleeing cities and going to the suburbs and taking their money with them, because as you know, education is funded on property taxes. And so if your property is worth more, you have more money to put into the schools. We have the war on drugs. We like to have wars on things in America, if you've noticed. So the war on drugs, it disproportionately affected African Americans. And here is a quote from an interview with John Erkelman. He was a top Nixon advisor. And he said, the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So it was a way to go after people that the undesirables, was through this heavy punishment of drug use and drug sales. And it also led to the sentencing disparities between black and white people charged with the same crime. For example, like cocaine and crack, because crack cocaine was associated with black people, and like straight cocaine was like, if you think of the 80s, Wall Street, everybody's doing blow, they are not going to be charged as much as maybe someone that's doing crack up in Harlem or the Bronx, just because they have two different sentencing guidelines based on how the drug is prepared, I guess. We start broken windows. So it was an idea that like if there's a neighborhood that's on kind of a downward spiral, if we start seeing broken windows, that means that then they don't care about the neighborhood. It's a sign of things to come. And I believe the intent was to be like, once you see the broken window, oh, it's time to do something. Let's come together and figure out why the windows are broken. But law enforcement took it as, let's get them early. So they started getting people on really, really small petty offenses as a way to curb violence. Things like stop and frisk, mandatory minimum sentencing, all these different little things, because somehow that was going to stop crime. But it just made a lot of people get into the correctional, like mass incarceration, basically. We're trying to think about how we can abolish different like prisons and stuff, because there's a lot of money in private prisons. There's a lot of money in locking people up, especially when cities are trying to make money. So if we think about Ferguson outside of St. Louis, most of the police officers that worked in Ferguson didn't actually live there, and they made a lot of money. The city made a lot of money on just locking people up. That was an income stream for them. Speculators. So the next scam that happens in America. So we've gotten this idea that home ownership is the American dream, and banks figure out a way to put this idea and to kind of profit off of this desire in another community. So that's when we start getting like predatory lending. So if we remember the foreclosure crash in the housing bubble in 2008, that was because they were giving loans to people that didn't qualify under all of these old standards, and they would get balloon payments. So you would start with the mortgage and it'd be something easy that you could pay, and then you wouldn't read the fine print, and then later on the payments would be huge and you could not afford them. But by that time, the initial company that sold you that mortgage didn't really care because they had sold it to somebody else. So we had a lot of people that thought they'd gotten the American dream, but they couldn't afford it and they're foreclosed on. And so then we have serial displacement. So because people can't afford homes, or they get evicted from their apartment, or like climate change, like if we have like in New Orleans from the Hurricane Katrina, or the Rockaways from Hurricane Sandy in Brooklyn, people have to keep moving. And since we've kind of given up on the city and the urban center idea, that means people are kind of flung out all over different metropolitan areas. If you think about like Section 8, because we stopped having public housing, we're like, let's put people all over the place. But because most American cities don't have that great of public transport, that means that low-income people are far flung, and it's going to take them longer to get to jobs that pay well. So they're spending a lot of time in transit to get places. There are some lessons that they want us to learn from this timeline that I think are really important. And two of the big takeaways that I think are lesson number 5, that significant social change has come through people-driven movements and never began with top-down forces. So the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the labor movement, tenants' rights, all of these things start from the bottom and then go up. And then lesson number 6, there seems to be a pattern of qualitative differences between bottom-up self-funded movements and philanthropic-driven movements. So basically that means when the people at the top think that they know what they're doing and they have a lot of good intentions, it doesn't make as big a difference and it's not as effective as when it's people-driven. When the people at the bottom, people whose issues are who are affected by the issues are able to be decision makers and policymakers. Fourth part is the living archive. So this is different stories from our metropolitan area. We are in North Omaha, so we are very close to the Omaha North Star. So it started in 1930 by Mildred Brown. She always wore a carnation. And the newspaper worked as like basically like a community bulletin board. It celebrated different achievements in the Black community. It spread information about jobs, and it also was instrumental in helping support different boycotts. For example, like the Poor's Club, which happened to meet at the Omaha Star, started a boycott of Coca-Cola because they would not hire any Black employees. Here, this is my favorite story because it's about the idea of rule of law and mob violence, and the idea of in what ways has this behavior been allowed to permeate throughout history. So we don't often think of Nebraska as the Wild Wild West, but it kind of was. Before we became a state, it wasn't legal to actually like own land, but a few white guys got together and started the Omaha Claim Club. And it was basically like, if you get a plot of land and you make improvements on it, we're gonna write you a deed out and now it's yours. We don't have that authority, we made it up, but we will use mob violence like arson, lynching, intimidation, all kinds of things to enforce the rule that we made up. And they even asked the government to hold off making Nebraska a state just so they could get more of their like power-hungry fun in. The story that really captures how violent and lawless this was there was an Irishman named Callahan who moved to Omaha in the 1850s. He got a little bit of land, he built a house, he was doing what this claim thing was all about, but he was not the right kind of white at that time. And the Omaha Claim Club did not like his kind in their territory. So they kept trying to pressure him to sell his land and he wouldn't do it. And so finally they got together, grabbed him out of his home, got him very, very drunk, dumped him in a river. They dumped him in the river first, and then they got him very drunk to revive him, and then they made him sign away the deed to his home, and he died penniless. So that's just part of our, every state, every country has kind of a myth and like an origin story that paints them as good, but mob violence, like if, I didn't talk about it, but like Willie Brown and lynchings, these things have happened even in our lovely area. Landmarks, so Peony Park, depending on where you grew up and basically what race you are, you or your grandparents or your parents might have different memories of Peony Park. It was very definitely segregated for a very long time. Even though they would sometimes have like swim meets for like high school kids, if they were Black kids, they were not allowed to go in. And it didn't change until the NAACP's Youth Council started a peaceful protest for days to be able to use this facility. And eventually they were. And from 1963 to 1994, Black people were allowed to use Peony Park. But this is something that's like a landmark. People have very fond memories of it, but it was very segregated. Down here is just like the history of union busting in Omaha. This particularly is about the streetcars and how business owners did not want them to have a union. But it also plays out in the stockyards. So like people would try to form a union, they would fire all those people and then get a new group of people in to work for lower and not fight for their rights. And that does result in different riots, like the Greektown riot and other ones. And then that's when like African Americans could start working in the stockyards because they were basically scabs, people that would work for less. So there's a long history of union busting in Omaha. All right. So the fifth part, how can we undesign redlining? So we've learned about the history of redlining, we've looked at some local stories, we've seen how redlining fits into the history of our country and how it impacts us today and its new permutations. We've looked at more local stories. Now that we know all these things, how do we undesign it? So that's really the purpose and the goal of the exhibit is to have people think about community building and city planning and all these things in a different way, knowing what they know now about redlining. And there are three main ways to do that. They want to reframe, so that's changing a narrative about the value of different people. And there are some 10 lies that redlining taught me that you can look at your leisure. And kind of gets to when you have communities and cities set up like this and they're segregated, people start to believe that it's always been that way and there's a reason, and maybe some people just don't like to live in nice places, which is not true. You reframe the stories, you think about the people that can help your cause in a different way and not to devalue people based on disability or income. The second one is redesign. So they really want people to be more collaborative and community driven. Because we've talked about how most of the real social change comes from bottom up, and it includes multiple stakeholders. In this case, like the saying, like money talks, like we don't want it to talk that loud. Sometimes the people with the most money get to make the decisions, and they're not always the best ones. So they want more people to be involved in decision making and to think about different problems in a different way. So the story that they use for this one is about a community center in this community somewhere on the East Coast. And there were community leaders. Some of them wanted to have a space for day laborers to make sure they were getting their rights, getting paid well, all those kind of things. And then other people wanted a space like a maker space for entrepreneurs and artists and all that kind of thing. And so they'd have these meetings, and sticky notes were used, and pointing, and maps, and walls, and talking, and discussion groups. And at one of these meetings, somebody pointed out, with everyone in the room, someone asked, but don't emerging artists also look for gigs and day jobs? They started a conversation about language and the difference between day laborer on the one hand and freelancer on the other. And they asserted that the main difference between them was race and class. So despite their good intentions, they created two spaces designed around differences of race and class. Basically, both populations are hustling for jobs every day, but they didn't think of them as having the same problem because of basically race and class. So we want to redesign based on what are the real issues. If we take away race and class, what are we trying to serve? The last one is reinvest. And investment doesn't just mean money, it means time, capability, knowledge, skills, and they have this big ecosystem. They have the best graphics. It's very exciting. So shared equity model. So they want everybody to benefit from whatever the new project or organization or movement is. And the story that they have down here is about a community garden, or more like an urban farm. So a group of do-gooders with great intentions got together and they're like, we're gonna make an urban farm. Well, the people that live in that community were afraid that this kind of structure, this kind of organization would actually lead to higher home values. They thought they'd be priced out of their home, because this is something kind of like that they thought people with higher incomes would really enjoy. And also when it comes to things like urban farms and urban gardens, things based around food, like food is very personal and culturally specific. So just because you think it'd be great to grow certain foods that you're familiar with and comfortable with, doesn't mean the people that you're trying to serve also like those foods. And if you don't ask them and get people's buy-in at the beginning, then they may not participate. So they changed this around. They tried to think of ways to design it so that it got more of the community that was there, and that they could sell the idea that it was for them. They weren't trying to like flip the neighborhood and make it more gentrified. So reinvest, redesign, reframe. So now, as the director says, now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So I don't have any answers for you, but just start looking around, start thinking, start really thinking about like the history of the neighborhood that you live in, what kind of people live there, why is that? Think about the areas of town that you go to, what kind of people do you see there, why is that? Think about what beliefs you have about people that live in different areas from you. Think about if you go to those areas, if you're comfortable, why or why not, what kind of judgments you're making about people there. And then also think about how the most important changes in America's history have come from people on the bottom. Not a lot of money, not big ideas up here, but movements from the bottom. And those movements were based on real people that were part of it. It wasn't top down, it wasn't charity or philanthropy or giving money to peasants. It was working with people. And if we think about reframing, redesigning, and reinvesting, hopefully we can undesign the red line. Thank you. Bye.